pastor, moved us to Springfield because he had a church there, or was given a church.
All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. We are about to start, and I'm going to hand it over to Brian Boyles, Executive Director of Mass Humanities, to get us started.
Good evening and welcome to Mass Miss. I am Brian Boyles. It's such a pleasure to see so many people from Mississippi and Massachusetts here tonight. Before we started, I do want to acknowledge the very troubled times we are in this country and to thank all of you all for making the choice tonight to build a bridge. We began planning this Mass many months ago, but the events in recent weeks have made us all the more committed to this partnership and the humanities. This project is really the product of the staffs of the Mississippi Humanities Council and Mass Humanities, and it's my great pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Director of Grants at Mass Humanities, Catherine Stevens.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here. I'm going to take a few moments, hopefully a few, to orient us to this event. So you know we are recording this event, but we will not record the parts of the event where you are having conversations in your Zoom rooms. So everyone should be on mute now, and we ask that you stay on mute during the program until we enter breakout rooms. If you're having trouble with Zoom controls and staying on mute, one of our staff will come in and help you stay on mute. If you're having other technical difficulties, you can email Jennifer Hall-Witt, and you should have received her email in a reminder. You can also private chat her using the chat function. So with so many people in this audience, the best way to view the program is to use the speaker view. So if you're seeing a lot of different people's faces, you're on gallery view. What you really want to see is just one main person's face speaking. So usually those controls are on the corners of your Zoom window. The most important part of our MS+ events is, of course, conversation among audience members in the breakout rooms. So one of the goals is to foster conversations across our state and with other welcome guests from around the country and potentially the world. So to do that, we need your help. So what we need to do is have you change your names as they appear on Zoom. So you should see that my name says MA and then my name. And so what I've done is I've put MA, my state's initials, in front of my name. So I can give you some directions for how to do that. So if you're looking for your Zoom controls, they tend to be, if you're on a personal computer or a laptop, at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you're on an iPad or an iPhone, they might be at the top or to the side. What you can do is you can look for the participants icon, sort of shaped like a silhouette of a person. You can click on that. That will open up a participants list. You should see your name on that list, and you will be able to rename yourself. If you click on a blue button, if you hover over your name, that should say rename. So that's how you rename yourself. If you're not able to do that, we will send you a private message and see if we can get you renamed. We can also assist renaming without a message to you. If we're not able to rename you, that's fine. Don't worry. You'll still enter a breakout room. You will just be a mystery entrant from an unknown state, but that will be just fine. So that is how we're going to orient ourselves to this program. Thank you all for listening to this part. I think the more interesting part is about to begin, and I'm going to hand it over to Stuart Rockoff from the Mississippi Humanities Council to introduce our program.
Thank you so much, Catherine, and thanks to all of y'all for being with us this evening. When we started to plan this series, we knew that we wanted to do a session on the connections between Massachusetts and Mississippi during the struggle for civil rights. Here in Mississippi, the movement was made by local people with the support of activists from other parts of the country. As Brian mentioned at the outset, we are certainly mindful of the current political climate in which we hold tonight's program. Our hope is that we can learn from the past and find in the difficult, tragic, yet ultimately inspiring story of the Mississippi freedom struggle a pathway forward to create a more just society. And I should say that we believe in free speech and civil discourse, and our panelists this evening are free to express their views. But I have to say that those views do not necessarily reflect those of the Mississippi Humanities Council, Mass Humanities, or the National Endowment for the Humanities. So everyone is covered. You can say whatever you want. Creating a space to learn about and discuss the legacy of our country's history of white supremacy and the struggle against it central to the work of the Mississippi Humanities Council since we were founded in 1972. This is due to the commitment of our founding director, Dr. Cora Norman, who passed away earlier this week at the age of 94. In the early years of the council, while race remained a taboo in many parts of our state, Dr. Norman ensured that the council addressed this issue head on, using the tools of the humanities to help us understand how the contemporary challenges Mississippi faced were rooted in our difficult past. And so we continue this work tonight in dedication to the life and legacy of Cora Norman. It is now my great honor to introduce my friend and our moderator for this evening, Dr. Daphne Chamberlain. Daphne is a native of Columbus, Mississippi, and is Associate Professor of History, the Associate Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Tougaloo College, a remarkable and historic institution that was central to the Mississippi freedom struggle. A scholar of the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. Chamberlain was the founding director of the COFO Civil Rights Education Center at Jackson State University. And so it is my great pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Chamberlain, who will introduce our panel.
Good evening, and thank you, Stuart. Again, I am Daphne Chamberlain, and it gives me great pleasure to serve as your moderator for this evening's event. I would first like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Stuart Rockoff and Ms. Catherine Stevens of both the Mississippi Humanities Council and the Massachusetts Humanities Council for extending the invitation for me to be a part of this program. And it is one that is sure to be engaging and empowering to all of those who are in participation this evening. Tonight's discussion is going to be centered around Freedom Summer. It was July 1964, and a young white college student sat in the COFO office located on John R. Lynch Street in Jackson, Mississippi. In a media interview, he demonstrated sage wisdom even in his youth by articulating these words: "My freedom is entangled with the freedom of every other man. So if another man is not free, then I am not free." This evening, we gather in this virtual space to engage in a powerful and authentic dialogue with those who help to transform communities across the state of Mississippi and those Native Mississippians who impacted the lives of the civil rights workers and volunteers who came to participate in the Mississippi Summer Project. Tonight, we remember Freedom Summer, and we celebrate the women and men who built a movement, who built bridges, and initiated change. And we are joined by some of them this evening. It is an honor to have on our panel Elaine Baker, Charlie Cobb Jr., and Roy DeBerry. Miss Elaine Baker was born in Winthrop, Massachusetts. In May of 1964, she left for Mississippi as part of a joint summer program between Tougaloo College and volunteer students and faculty from Harvard University. While at Tougaloo, Elaine was recruited to write a survey for use in COFO summer projects, which led to an invitation to the Freedom Summer orientation held in Oxford, Ohio. Elaine went on to spend the next year in Mississippi as core staff, working in federal programs around the state, including her last project, working with COFO staff and local community members to organize an okra co-op in Batesville, Mississippi. Elaine went on to utilize the life experiences and skills that she had learned in the movement in the rest of her life, including her 20 years in rural Colorado and her 20 years as a community college teacher, administrator, and national consultant in programs targeting low-income and minority students. We welcome Elaine Baker. Next on our panel is Mr. Charlie Cobb Jr. Mr. Cobb was raised in Springfield, Massachusetts, but planted his feet firmly in the Mississippi soil to challenge and eradicate the injustice he saw in the state. As a student at Howard University and a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC, Charlie became accustomed to participating in sit-ins and other direct action protest activities. But in 1962, his life was changed forever when he stepped foot off a bus in Jackson, Mississippi. Charlie has been called the architect of the Freedom Schools. And as a SNCC field secretary, he proposed the creation of Freedom Schools to empower Mississippians to, quote, articulate their own desires, demands, and questions. Charlie also believed that Freedom School students would be the force for social change in Mississippi. Mr. Cobb is a journalist, he's an educator, and the author of several books, including his 2013 release, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed, How Guns Made the Civil Rights Movement Possible. We welcome Charlie Cobb Jr. Our last panelist, but not least, is Dr. Roy DeBerry. Dr. DeBerry is a native of Holly Springs, Mississippi. He was active as a high school student in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, first as a Freedom School prep student, whose teacher was his co-founder of the nonprofit organization that he's the director of, Aviva Futurian, and then as a general organizer in the movement. Roy earned his bachelor's degree in sociology at Brandeis University in 1970. He continued his education at Brandeis and then went on to earn a master's and later a doctorate in political science in 1978. He also pursued additional studies at Jackson State University, Duke University, Carnegie Mellon, Michigan, and Harvard universities. Dr. DeBerry went on to serve as Assistant Superintendent for Education in the state of Mississippi, and now is the Executive Director and one of the founders of the nonprofit organization, the Hill Country Project, which records the stories of the residents of Benton County who have lived through the civil rights movement and beyond, and provides education support to local school districts. We welcome Dr. Roy DeBerry. These are our panelists for the evening. And again, I am sure this is going to be an engaging discussion as we remember Freedom Summer and the people who made it happen. Now, just to give you an overview of Freedom Summer, you all were provided with a number of sources in preparation for tonight's discussion. And the SNCC Digital Gateway is a fascinating site with movement history that offers primary and secondary source materials for those who are interested in learning more about the civil rights movement in America. And on the site's Freedom Summer page, it reads, in 1963, violence aimed at halting civil rights struggle in Mississippi was intensifying. The federal government continued its reluctance to intervene, and most of the nation was largely unaware of the terror and denial unfolding in Mississippi. Therefore, COFO decided to bring attention to conditions by bringing the nation's children to Mississippi. And there were three aims or campaigns that were part of that 10-week long hot summer. And those are some we will discuss this evening. The Freedom Schools, the increase of Black voter registration, and ultimately the challenge to the all-white delegation of the Democratic Party. Now, before we get into our discussion about Freedom Summer, for each of our panelists, Ms. Baker, Mr. Cobb, and Dr. DeBerry, in just a few minutes, would you please share your upbringing and your first experience with Jim Crow or exposure to Jim Crow? And we'll start with you, Ms. Baker.
Here we go. Okay. I think it was really in two stages. One was a kind of a visceral stage when I was young. My great-grandfather emigrated from Russia to Sparta, Georgia in 1888. Don't ask me why. But he lived there, and my mother grew up there. She spent the first 20 of her first 25 years in Sparta. When she married my father, he was a Northerner, and after the war, they moved, really actually after Pearl Harbor, they went, he was supposed to work in the Naval Shipyard in Boston, so they moved to Boston. And then my grandparents moved up and lived with us in the house. There were always stories of the South. It was part of the lore of the family because they were basically a Southern family living in a northern town. You could feel it. I feel things. I can generally feel what people are feeling in their hearts when they speak. I guess you call me an empath. But I remember my grandfather was definitely a racist, and he talked about the darkies and knife fights on Saturday nights. And my grandmother was this incredible woman, was never spoke an ill word. She didn't gossip. She was a lovely, brilliant woman. She never contributed to those conversations, but when I was 12, she gave me my great-grandfather's diary that he had kept when he came. And he wrote about when he came, having no money, working in the fields with Black people and how hard it was. It was brutal. So that kind of went into my background, I guess. And the diary was my first introduction to the South, along with the ambivalence of my family. The second was the trip that I took in a Greyhound bus when going down to Mississippi in 1964. I was alone in the bus, and I just saw what happened when we crossed the Mason-Dixon line. The way people in the bus, Black people in the bus, how they sat, how they whispered to themselves, how they ate on the bus instead of getting off, how they walked in and off the bus when they came into the South. It was very, very powerful. So I think that was my real introduction. That was along with the smell of honeysuckles and a lot of the beautiful of the South. Mm-hmm. But that change in the way they acted when they crossed the Mason-Dixon line told me that we were in a different country, really.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. And for those of you who are familiar with Robert Bob Moses, he's often quoted as having said, when you're in Mississippi, the rest of America doesn't seem real. And when you're in the rest of America, Mississippi doesn't seem real. So that seems very true of what you're saying and reflective of what you're saying. So thank you for that insight. Charlie, you have family ties to the state of Mississippi. So if you would please share your upbringings or your first experience with Jim Crow. You're on mute.
Yes, my family ties don't really have a lot to do with directly confronting racism. It's a post-Civil War experience. My family, my great-grandfather migrated to Mississippi from Alabama, where he had been enslaved, and with a group of other newly freed Black people, helped found a community that still exists in Mississippi called New Africa, just out from Clarksdale, Mississippi. It's no longer the farming community it was in the 19th century. Most of the people in that community work in the small city of Clarksdale. My family, in the sense of my parents and aunts and uncles and grandmother, were always a race family, to use. They believed in that you were obligated, and I grew up with this, you were obligated as a Black person to struggle for, to use Marcus Garvey's old term, the redemption and vindication of the race. You were duty bound to do that. So I grew up kind of surrounded, particularly in the 1950s as I was growing up in Massachusetts, with conversations about race, the Supreme Court decision, the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, the Little Rock 9, lynchings, and the like, just grew. That was part of just the routine conversation in the living room or at the dinner table and the like. So, but it was not specific for me. What the first issue around race that becomes very, very specific for me relates to my generation, and that's the murder of Emmett Till. That's what caught our attention, seeing that, and I can still see it in my head, seeing that what is called in media business, the double truck spread of in the Jet magazine of Emmett Till's basically mutilated and bloated body caught the attention of my entire generation of young, but he was our age. Emmett Till was 14 years old when he was murdered, and we were, when he was murdered, roughly 14 or 15 years old. He was one of us. And that commanded our attention for the first time, I would argue, more than the Supreme Court decision, more than the Montgomery bus boycott, more than anything. It was Till's murder. And I can remember the conversations we had as teen. Maybe we should organize an army and go down there and shoot some Ku Klux Klansmen. We had those kinds of conversations, and it really shaped our consciousness. I often tell people we are the Emmett Till generation. When I talk about who formed SNCC, I say we're the Emmett Till generation. And that's how I ultimately wind up in Mississippi. So there's that. My first and the last thing I'll say is that my direct conversation with white supremacy, because I grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts, and you're not going to find segregated restaurants there. You're not going to be denied access to the library and all the things that were routine in the South. My first confrontation with racism was when I decided to stay in Mississippi. And it's 1962, and I decided because I was going to stay in Mississippi, I should get a Mississippi driving license. And to get a driving license in those days, you went to the state highway patrol. And I walked in there, I tell people when I tell this story, I say, I walked in there Massachusetts style. I just walked in and yelled out, is this where you get a driving license? And the next thing I knew, some state policeman had grabbed me by my shirt and slammed me against the wall and slapped me and then threw me out the door. And as I lay sprawled in the dust, he leans over me and he says, now, nigga, don't ever come in here without saying, sir. And I was telling this to some middle school kids a few years ago, and they said, well, what did you do then? And I said, I got up, dusted myself off, and left with the guy who brought me. And one of these kids said, you let him disrespect you like that? And I said, well, I wanted to be around to tell you this story. But it led to a conversation about police and young people and police. So something came out of me telling that story, because once they understood what the environment was like, it really wasn't very different than their own experiences or the experiences of their friends with police and police violence. And they could get a hold of it that way. And there's lots of other, Mississippi was, believe me, for me, coming from Massachusetts, another world. And it took some adjusting to learn how to move in this world, which was unlike any world I had ever thought of, let alone lived in.
Thanks, Charlie. And what I got out of that, and I'm sure everyone else heard the same thing that I heard, was that through the narrative that you just shared, Charlie, that there are these easy connections that you can make between the past and the present.
Yes.
And that is what this history can teach future generations, that there are some links, and that if we don't know where we've been, we don't know where we're going and how we can build a roadmap for the future. So thank you for that. Dr. DeBerry, If you would please share your upbringing in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and your memory or memories of first experience with Jim Crow.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Well, first of all, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Doc, for the introduction. I concur with Brother Cobb there with respect to Emmett Till. I was a little bit younger than they were. I think I was 8 when I heard he had been killed in Sunflower County, Mississippi. And we got our news basically from the Chicago Defender, because at that time you were not allowed to having the newspapers like that around. So you had these people would come down on the train. Highway 78 came straight through Holly Springs on the way to Birmingham and Atlanta. And the porters would throw off papers off the train, and local people would go in and pick up the paper. There was one man, Mr. Wilkins, who used to get the paper all the time. And he lived about a mile from where the school was, where I was attending, when we got the news from our teacher that Emmett had been killed. And obviously I saw some of the same pictures in Jet magazine, as well as the Chicago Defender that Charlie talked about. But prior to that, I grew up in Holly Springs. My maternal people are from Lafayette County in Oxford, where I am now. And my daddy people obviously grew up in Holly Springs, but actually his people came to Holly Springs from North Carolina. And I've been doing some research just to try to trace specifically in North Carolina where they came from. We grew up in a small farm outside of Holly Springs, about 2 miles. So for the most part, white people did not exist for us. We went to Black schools, we went to a Black church, we had our own Black community. So as a youngster, I was in contact with my brothers and other neighbors, but I didn't come into contact with white people much. My first contact really was when, as a youngster, my mother and dad would go to town on Saturday evening after working the farm during the week. And that was a time when you would see, and Holly Springs always had a pretty sizable Black community. And so you had your Black doctors, you had your Black grocery store owners. And for the most part, we would hang out. Obviously, that I saw right away was the fountains, and obviously you could not go into a cafe other than the cafe that was owned by Black people. And I would see examples when I would go by some of the Black cafes. You would see cops come in, who would come in and pretty much take over if they didn't like something going on. So really my earlier contact had to do was when we came to town to buy certain items that we had to have, seeing those obvious signs like the restrooms and the water fountains. Other than that, I did not have any early direct contact with white people.
Thank you, Dr. DeBerry. And we appreciate having that insight and, of course, those reflections from each of you on your earliest memories of Jim Crow. This next question is going to be for Elaine and Charlie, as it relates to you all coming from the North and to Mississippi during the heart of the struggle for Black freedom here in the state of Mississippi. But my question to you all is, what influenced your decision to come to Mississippi before 1964? I know for you, Charlie, and especially during the summer of 1964 to work alongside other volunteers for the Mississippi Summer Project. So either one of you can answer the question, but I would like for both of you all to share your thoughts.
Charlie?
You're on mute, Charlie. Charlie, you're still on mute.
Okay, is that better? I didn't intend to come to Mississippi. As a Howard University student, I was involved in the sit-ins because everything around Washington, D.C. was segregated in Maryland and Virginia. And Washington, D.C. had only recently desegregated in the middle, 1953, I think, was when legalized segregation begins to end in Washington. But because I was involved in the sit-ins, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, invited me to a workshop in Houston, Texas for a conference or something for student activists to meet and discuss, sort of like Ella Baker did that led to the founding of SNCC. And they gave me money for a bus ticket because you didn't fly anywhere back in those days. And I got on the bus. I said, well, my attitude was I was less interested in the conference in Houston, Texas, than I was in just getting an opportunity to see the South on this bus trip. And I had this ticket from Washington, D.C., where I was a student, through Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and on into Houston, Texas. But I got off the bus in Mississippi, in Jackson, because the students in Jackson were sitting in. And my attitude was, it's one thing for me to be sitting in Virginia or Maryland. It's something qualitatively different for students to be sitting in Mississippi. That's where Emmett Till was killed. And that was my whole image of Mississippi. I said, and so I said, I need to meet them before I leave Mississippi and find out what kind of people, Black people, would be sitting in Mississippi, which I considered, and most of my friends considered, the worst place in the universe for a Black person. And I actually made my way to their headquarters with the help of the NAACP, I might add, which was listed in the telephone book. And I told the students that were there, and I'm the ones that haven't passed away, I still talk to regularly, Dory Ladner, and others. So I told them what I'm telling you. I said, well, I'm on the way to a student workshop for activists like me on college campuses, sponsored by CORE. And one of the students who was there, who's passed, Lawrence Giat, who had just finished at Tougaloo and would later, in addition to organizing with SNCC up in the Delta, would later become the chair of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. He gets up from where he's sitting and he kind of hovers over me. And some of you may know Giat. He's a big guy. And was a big guy, and he hovered over me and looks at me with complete disdain. And he says, and I remember his words exactly, he said, "You're going to Texas for a workshop on civil rights? What's the point of doing that when you're standing right here in Mississippi?" And I got the message. It was a challenge, Yeah, you can go up to Texas or somewhere else and chatter about civil rights, but we're doing stuff in Mississippi. And Giat was getting ready to go up into the Delta, Greenwood. So I had to think about that. And my attitude was, well, it's summer. I don't have to be in school, so I'll just stick with these guys. Charles McLaurin was getting ready to go up. Giat, another Jackson State student named Landy McNair. There was a whole little group of guys. Dory was going to come up. So I said, I'll hang with these folks. And I get in the car and go up into the Delta with them and wind up in Mississippi. This was not planned at all. And there's probably contained within this an important lesson about the movement. And that is, as much as it involved protest against white supremacy, segregation, and discrimination, just as important, and I would argue more importantly, it involved challenges Black people made to one another within the Black community, because that's what Giat is doing to me. He's saying, if you're serious, come with us. And I do. I go up there and I spend the whole summer. And at the end of the summer, I realized that you can't just do this for a few weeks. and then look at the people you've now put at risk, because if they work with you, they were placing themselves at risk, the older people, and say, well, it's been interesting, folks, but I got to register for classes. I mean, I'm not made up that way. So I wound up staying for the next 4 or 5 years in Mississippi. So that's how I got to Mississippi and wound up staying in Mississippi. And I got absorbed, if you will, by SNCC, I think, because I think Bob Moses told them I was there, so they might as well make me a SNCC staff person as well.
Thanks, Charlie. And I've been knowing Charlie for several years, so I'm always happy to hear Charlie tell the story of how he came to Mississippi but didn't intend to stay in Mississippi. But we are absolutely glad you did, because the work that you did continues to live on. If you all check in the chat, you will see some of the people who Charlie made reference to, like Lawrence Giat, Dory Ladner, Bob Moses. Some of those people are featured in the Mississippi Encyclopedia, so we invite you all to peruse those encyclopedia entries at your convenience. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.
Elaine, if you would, of course, share what brought you to Mississippi, but also in 1964, but also share some of your first experiences on the ground in the state as a summer volunteer during Freedom Summer. And you're on mute.
Okay, we got it. Like Charlie, it was not really a conscious decision from here to there. It was really an outgrowth of what was happening in my life at Harvard. I was at Radcliffe, and over I guess it was over the Christmas break, I was in an apartment with a boyfriend of mine at the time, and the police came through the door. They were looking for an underage girl who they had been told, actually her uncle was a police captain in the Cambridge Police, which is kind of notorious for being a family operation. They came in, they walked into our bedroom and arrested us for 2 felonies and a misdemeanor, lewd and lascivious behavior, corrupting the morals of a minor, and fornication. So it was like, and they took us to jail. They took her to jail. They sent in the priest. She was Irish Catholic, and then they paroled her to her mother. The captain of the police force was her family member. And then we were, Ricky and I were expelled. We were not expelled, we were suspended from college. And then there was a whole trial and all kinds of interesting situations, because at the time, this was 1964, it was, they confiscated my birth control pills, which were illegal in Massachusetts. So through all this, they did let me back in. I finished the semester. I was just really horrified at how I'd been treated, how condescending the deans, the male deans who invited me to the office to discuss this were. So that was I was just really, I had a very bad feeling about Harvard at that time. And then my friend, I had a number of friends, and one of them had organized a summer in Tougaloo to teach. So some of the faculty members, I think it was 6 faculty members, could study in the North, and we would take over classes. And they said, "You want to come?" And I said, "Sure." And that was it. I had no idea where I was going, what I was getting into. And it was wonderful. I loved my time at Tougaloo, but one day, Casey Hayden and Jesse Morris came walking up the hill, as you know. and said, well, you were working with Dr. Pettigrew at Harvard, and he did a study of housing, Black housing project, and I'd done work with him, and they asked me if I would design a questionnaire to be used in the different summer programs, and I said, sure, and I hadn't finished it, and it was time to go to orientation in Oxford. So I just got on the bus, and there I was. So that's how I got there. When I got there, so I was kind of in between. I wasn't a volunteer. I had no orientation. I was kind of semi-staff. They kind of used me where I could be useful as I worked on the survey, which wasn't very good actually, but I was on the Watts line with, when the news came in, I was sitting next to Rita when the news came in over the Watts line that the boys were missing. I think that was it. That was it. The energy at Oxford, it was incredible. I wouldn't say it was wonderful. It was powerful, but it was also, this is real, guys. This is real. The people who were there, the local people knew they were dead. There was no question. There was questions about asking people if giving them permission to leave. I don't think anybody left. But those were some of my first experiences in the real movement. I mean, I love Tougaloo, and as I've come back over for different reunions, it's so wonderful to see what the college is today. It was wonderful then, but it didn't have the resources to do the things that it does now. So it's a pleasure to see you and to be in contact. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine. And as a shameless plug, I'm a Tougaloo alum. And for those of you who aren't familiar with historic Tougaloo College, it is founded on the land of a former slave plantation. So there's some very unique history that's deeply entrenched in the social justice movement. And of course, we have made sure that we have maintained that history, but also sustained our legacy as an institution that is fighting for freedom, justice, and equity for all. So thank you, Elaine, for that. Dr. DeBerry, of course, being a native Mississippian who was a Freedom School student, what was your community's response to the arrival of some volunteers?
Well, let me start with 1962, because in 1962 was a time when my brother and I, who's 2 years older than I am, stood on the square in Holly Springs and watched about 30,000 troops march from Oxford, marched from Memphis through Holly Springs on the way to Oxford to secure the facility there in Oxford to protect Jane Meredith as he entered the University of Mississippi, otherwise known as Ole Miss. And my brother and I looked around and he said, we had heard our grandparents who had fought in World War I, and my people that had fought in World War II, we said to ourselves, even as youngsters, we just thought that was so odd that troops were coming through town in that number. We had never seen that many federal troops before go down to a public university to make it possible for one Black student to enter. That just left an impression that I never could get over for a long time. Then it came 1963, and Frank Smith had been an organizer in Holly Springs. That was really before 64. So we had had some involvement there in Holly Springs, some involvement there as high school students with the local movement, because as I said earlier, keep in mind, although we give a lot of credit, rightfully so, to outsiders who came in 1964, I think we have to understand, and we wrote a book about that later. It was the local people that had put together a lot of framework, and I think Charlie mentioned that earlier. One of the first things that I did as a young person in that summer of 64, we got together, and Medgar Evers, you recall, had been assassinated in 1963. And so we had this concern about what could we say, what kind of message could we give as a way to celebrate that awful murder. And so we sat around the lawn of Rusk College, another historically Black college, one of the oldest in the state, along with a volunteer from New York City named David Flynn. And we wrote a play called Seeds of Freedom, which we sort of improvised at first, and then under the direction of David Flynn, we put it together in a play format. We put that play on in Holly Springs. We put that play on in Meridian, and then we were invited to put that play on in New York. And we did that. It was the first time, obviously, many of us had been to New York. And as was mentioned earlier, we took a bus. While we were there in New York, I had an opportunity for the first time to be interviewed by NBC News' Roger Mudd. And we also requested, we wanted to go and visit the home of Adam Clayton Powell, as well as his church there in Harlem. We got that chance. And although Malcolm X was assassinated later on in 1965, we did not get a chance to actually see Malcolm, but we also wanted to go to the place where, the street where he would speak. So that was some of it. But you also mentioned the Freedom Summer in the prep class. Aviva Futorian, who was a volunteer from Chicago, and who is also the co-editor of the book, along with Frank Siakoka, a great photographer, basically had a prep class that was in Benton County, which is about 15 miles northeast of Holly Springs. And I would drive up along with Aviva and attend that class. There was one example, and Charlie mentioned guns, and I can't help think but what happened between me and Aviva on the way to Benton County. It's sort of a very, how can I say, not well-lit road, country road at that time. And so on the way to the prep class, there was two of us. Obviously at that time, a Black and a white person shouldn't be riding in the same car. So we would drive up to Benton County. Mr. Reeves, Henry Reeves, and I know Charlie know Henry Reeves because he had been a local organizer, had a house right there on Highway 4. And before we would take the dirt road to go over to the place, the house where they conducted the class, I would stop by Mr. Reed's house and pick up a shotgun. And I didn't tell Aviva this, but I keep it in the trunk. And I would do that every time. Luckily, we encountered no problem. But I think he's right. In some instances, Mississippians didn't hesitate to protect themselves if they had to. Not in any way that was considered to be aggressive or offensive in any way. Back to Holly Springs as a 15 and then a 16-year-old, we used to hang out at something called the Freedom House. And Holly Springs was one of the places where they actually had a state headquarters. And around there, I had a chance as a youngster to meet and talk to Stokely Carmichael, Cleveland Sellers, Ivanhoe Donaldson. Of course, I had already mentioned Frank Smith. Howard Zinn came there. I think he had been in Spelman, Thornton Lynn, Bob Moses, of course, and so many other people. So the richness of being a high school student and being able to go over to this Freedom House and interact with these people was just it's so exciting as a youngster. And one of the things that they did even at that Freedom House was that we had library, they would bring books, we would read, we would discuss plays, we would discuss playwrights, Black authors, history people. And one of the things that we learned from this Freedom School, which Charlie obviously was the brainchild behind, was this notion of being a critical thinker, because he's rightfully, when he says, he's right when he says, at that time, one of the things that you were told not to do was to question authority. Most people would simply say to you, that's the way it is, so don't take it on. And some of us had that desire to not accept that. And I think these summer workers sort of helped us reinforce that desire to question authority, not only just in terms of white authority, but to question even Blacks in authority, i.e. my high school, where I was sort of almost kicked out, but managed to stay in until I graduated. So this notion of being a critical thinker was something that I gained very early, and I give a lot of credit to what we learned in Freedom School.
Thank you, Dr. DeBerry. And of course, clearly, what you learned in the Freedom Schools carried over into the work you did in education here in the state of Mississippi. So we appreciate you greatly. And that is a great segue to our next question. And this one will be for you, Charlie. In John Hale's book, The Freedom Schools, so I'm plugging all of these other sources that people can make reference to. John writes, a history of the Freedom Schools and the young students who attended them is a testament to the courage and conviction needed to join the front lines of the civil rights movement. And Roy DeBerry is the epitome of student activism as in response to what was learned in those freedom schools. And Charlie, you helped to solidify the Freedom Schools' place in history. If you would please share with us the inspiration for the Freedom Schools and how you all decided the curriculum design for those institutions that were positioned all across the state of Mississippi.
Well, the Mississippi Summer Project, before the Freedom Schools, Mississippi Summer Project, as we talked about it and discussed it, was going to bring upwards of 1,000 students from all over the country into Mississippi. Most of them, we assumed, and we're right, of course, were going to be white. So the question is, what are you going to do with them? Do you want to crisscross the state or the Delta with a carload of whites who don't know very much about Mississippi to start with? So the idea partly emerges out of trying to answer that question. What are you going to do with these students coming into the state? Secondly, we meaning SNCC and CORE or COFO in the broadest sense, saw ourselves as grassroots community organizers. And I want to emphasize the word organizers. And one of the things about organizing, if you're going to do it effectively, is you have to work within the consensus that exists in the community that you're trying to work in. We come out of the sit-in movement. Voter registration was really not on our minds until we began to interact with local people in these communities, and especially the local NAACP leadership in the state at local levels. And they made it very clear that what they needed our young energy for was voter registration. It was their way of articulating what they needed was some Black power. And they pushed us in that direction. And we could work on it. And there are lots of stories surrounding the efforts at voter registration in Mississippi and across the Black Belt South. There was another thing that there was an existing consensus about, and that was education. People knew, that the state didn't want to educate them in the first place. They only saw the role of Black people as a role of picking cotton or something. If you can look them up yourselves if you want, if you look at the numbers in terms of how much money is spent on schools in Black communities and how much money was spent on schools in white communities, the disparity was enormous. I mean, enormous. And I have them written down somewhere. I didn't bring them here to this computer. So if you were looking for, if you see yourselves as working for change within the consensus that exists in the community, education was an obvious thing to try and figure out how to tackle. Now the problem was we didn't have the manpower, or we didn't have really, or even the skills in some ways to tackle this enormous issue. We could see the problem if you either saw one of two things. If you looked at Black schools in Mississippi, for the most part, one, you saw completely rundown schools that were little more than shacks, or you saw brand new schools, except when you went to the library, there weren't any books in them, or you went to the science lab, there weren't things like microscopes and test tubes and all the other stuff you need. We could see the problem. We didn't have a way to deal with it until the summer of '64, when we now have, I think it was 900 and some odd students is the official number. So we decided, leading up to the summer project, to see if we could use these students to generate a different kind of educational process and to generate a different kind of consciousness that the state was trying. The state was constantly driving the idea that Black people are inferior. Black people are incapable of learning, and that Black people need to be kept out of the political process. So the '64 Summer Project gave us the manpower to try, and we envisioned it before we set up the schools. We could envision using at least some of that new influx of students to generate what we finally call freedom schools in Mississippi. It's interesting that one, we got double the number of students we anticipated participating in the Freedom School program. And secondly, we were surprised that in many communities, it wasn't just young people showing up for the Freedom Schools. It was older people. There were parents and grandparents that also wanted to be involved in it. We didn't anticipate that, but it makes sense when you think about it, because, in all the earlier generations, there was virtually no education. If you had a 6th grade education, you were well educated back in the day. Say in Mrs. Hamer's time, Mrs. Hamer had a 6th grade education. You were well educated. So we started together. And lastly, the schools offered us a way to work for change, again, within the Black community. People were afraid in many instances to go down to the county courthouse and try and register to vote, because it meant they had to confront the white authorities that control those courthouses, which is where you had to go to register to vote. But you could have freedom schools right inside the Black community. And you would get a kind of support, and this was proven in the summer, you would get a kind of support for these schools and participating in these schools that was much more difficult. Even when people expressed support for you, that was much more difficult around the question of registering to vote. People might tell you they believed in the right to vote, Black people, and thought the vote was a good thing. But when it comes to going down to the county, say in Sunflower County where I worked, the county courthouses was in Indianola, Mississippi. And Indianola was the birthplace of the White Citizens Council. And to go down to the county courthouse in that town, you really were risking something. Whereas if you had a school, although sometimes they were just a gathering underneath a tree, if you had a school inside the Black communities, you get a much more active participation. And as I said, we got double the number of people than we anticipated. I didn't organize the schools, I proposed it. But what we did was form a committee of people from some from Mississippi, educators. We had the head of the United Federation of Teachers. We had Noel Day, who had a kind of freedom school in Boston. Staunton Lynn, who was a professor of history at Spelman College. We gathered people we knew and who we knew were sympathetic to what we were trying to do and who were educators in a way that we were not, to actually put together the nuts and bolts of how you establish a school, what kinds of curriculum should there be if you wanted to try and do something like this. We leaned on a lot of slightly older but trained people to actually give shape to the freedom school, and they proved enormously popular. From an organizer's point of view, it's exactly what you want if you're trying to organize people and you're trying to figure out the ways and means of introducing people into struggle that you know puts their lives and livelihood at risk. Mm. That's the short version.
Thanks, Charlie. And that was extremely powerful, because what you just spoke to is how the Freedom Schools, but really Freedom Summer, built this bridge to opportunity for Blacks in the state of Mississippi, but they were already working for themselves to fight in this fight for freedom, as Dr. DeBerry has said. And of course, John Dittmer's Local People and Charles Payne's I've Got the Light of Freedom give more meat to that.
I just want to, if I can interrupt you for 1 second, I just want to stress that you cannot disconnect, and it's true today, though not as easily recognized, you cannot disconnect the freedom schools and the idea of education from political struggle for social change.
Exactly, exactly. And so the bridge to opportunity, the bridge to political power, as Charlie has just stated, but also the bridge to the future, which is going to help us transition to hearing from the future. I mentioned that Albert Sykes is the dream, or maybe I didn't. He's the dream of Medgar Evers and Fannie Lou Hamer. And now we'll hear from the contemporary of those who you have just heard from. So this evening we are joined by my friend and also somebody I consider to be my brother, Albert Sykes. Albert beams with pride when he talks about being the father of 4 sons. He sees the promise of the future when he looks at them. And through the work that he does, Albert is the dream of Medgar Evers, Fannie Lou Hamer, Charlie Cobb, Cortland Cox, who was on this call, and so many others. And Albert is a native of Jackson, Mississippi, and grew up in the community where Medgar Evers lived and died. In middle school, Albert became a student of the Algebra Project and a mentee of Robert Bob Moses. And through this experience, Albert gained much firsthand knowledge and understanding of Black Mississippi's struggle for justice, equity, and full citizenship. Albert is a true organizer and mobilizer. He has served as the policy and advocacy director of the Young People's Project. He has advocated with the NAACP for quality education as a constitutional right and served as a national trainer for the Children's Defense Fund Youth Advocate Leadership Training. Albert now serves as the executive director of the Institute for Democratic Education in America, also known as IDEA. So we welcome Albert to this conversation as a 21st century young organizer, a young civil rights advocate, and a lover of freedom. So Albert, welcome. And just as we get ready to transition to our breakout rooms so the audience can engage in a more robust and intimate conversation about the legacy of Freedom Summer, would you please share with us how the work of organizations like SNCC and COFO influenced the work that you've done through the years and also the work that you continue to engage in as a young activist?
Oh, yeah. I see Emily. How you doing? Love you. Yeah, so for myself, it's the foundation of everything that I know. I met Bob Moses. I was a 6th grade kid. I knew nothing about Freedom Summer. But what happened is the divine intervention of our ancestors and the folks who choose the paths of our lives. And so I'm sitting in my 6th grade class. Bob Moses is at the front of the class. This is in the community where Medgar Evers was assassinated. And right outside of our window is the Fannie Lou Hamer Library, right? So that's where everybody in my community goes to vote. And so I'm learning about who Bob is because all the adults in the building excited about him. To me, he was just an old man with a beard. He had gumdrops and toothpicks, and he was teaching us math in a different way, right? But it wasn't nothing like super cool or super appealing about Bob, except that all the adults were excited about who he was. Well, the thing that made me really draw to Bob was the story of Medgar Evers, because I grew up in that community, one street over from where he was assassinated. And I remember my grandmother teaching me about Medgar Evers because I was so excited about learning about Dr. King and Rosa Parks when we doing activities in elementary school where we just coloring their faces on these little coloring sheets that they give you with your crayons and whatever. And they tell you these stories about Dr. King was so great and Rosa Parks sat on the bus. And then the way that it was taught, it seemed so distant from anything that you could see yourself being a part of. And then my grandmother, I'm all excited, like, I learned about this guy named Martin Luther King. I learned about this lady named Rosa Parks. My grandmother takes me one street over, stands me in the driveway and tell me who Medgar Evers was, right? At a time where you could see his blood stains in the concrete, at a time where the house was dilapidated and had been forgotten about by so many people. And it's on the same street where Margaret Walker Alexander, one of the greatest Black writers in the history of this country, lived. The street is named for her. And both her house and Medgar Evers' house is on this street. So that's when I knew greatness could come from where I come from, was when my grandmother taught me about Medgar Evers in elementary school. I meet Bob Moses in middle school. Everybody thinks he's the bee's knees. And the only thing about him that's cool to me is that he mentioned that he had worked with Medgar Evers before. So now I felt like I could actually feel and touch this thing that was made so huge to me because of my grandmother. When I think about the legacy of freedom schools, the Algebra Project classroom itself was a freedom school. We wasn't just learning math. We wasn't just learning to do math in a different way. We were learning to have some control and some say and some stake in what our education was and how it should be. We were learning not just the freedom of having a relationship with numbers, but the freedom of having a relationship with our community and the problems that faced our community. And that critical thinking that's developed through math was one of the things that contributed to us being able to say, these are the things that we see in our community. Our critical thinking skills allow us to say that these are some possible solutions, and all we need is a support to be able to go and try those things. So that was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party on a much, much smaller level. It was at a community level where we had tasted this thing called the freedom of learning, and then we started to want to taste this thing called the freedom of being. Then we wanted to taste this thing called the freedom of having power, the freedom of having say-so. And so that's what drove a lot of us. What the Algebra Project did, which was real significant, and especially like thinking about it in parallels to what the Freedom Schools was doing, was the Algebra Project provided us things that usually stopped for us at 11:30 in the morning or 3:30 in the evening. That was learning and food. A lot of us came from homes where 11:30 lunch in middle school was the last time you ate in a day. Then a lot of us came from homes where 3:30 or 3 o'clock when middle school dismisses is the last piece of learning that you guaranteed to have in a day. Not because your family don't care, but because of the circumstances that makes your mom work all night, that makes your father work 2 or 3 jobs. And so what the Algebra Project did was answer our needs in a way that empowered us to answer the further needs of our own communities. So when you think about freedom schools, when you think about Freedom Summer and the remnants of it, then you got young people like Tamika Mallory, who don't let this country forget every time a Black life is stolen at the hands of the state. You got people like Latasha Brown, who did so much work around voter mobilization in November and then again in January. But Latasha been out there way before the presidential primaries, way before the big election. These folks started to build a relationship years ago that they can harness in moments like this. You have folks like Stacey Abrams, right, who is leading so many efforts where she ran for what we thought was the most powerful seat in the state. And then she turned out to be one of the most powerful people in the country because racism made sure that she didn't win that seat, but it couldn't make sure that she couldn't organize her people to turn that state, but to also have such a big impact in flipping this country. I mean, you got people like Anasa Trapman, who's running the Claiborne Temple out in Memphis. A Black woman who is really taking that temple and preserving it for the historic item that it is, but then it's also building on what the legacy of that temple can be for the next 2, 3, 4 generations of people that's to come and learn from it. Jessica Norwood doing great work in Alabama. You got Rukia Lumumba, who's leading the People's Advocacy Institute in Mississippi, focused on criminal justice reform, looking at things like education, looking at things like participatory budgeting. You got Danielle Holmes, who's leading the Mississippi Poor People's Campaign, really talking about equitable wages, which is one of the things that education has always been a tool for guaranteeing that Black people in this state will be at the bottom of the totem pole, will be at the bottom of the feeding pole, will be at the bottom of getting paid adequately for the things that they provide. So that's why Nissan can save $10 billion in taxes in the same time that the public schools in Mississippi lose $10 billion in investments, right? Because it's all set up for free and cheap labor. It's the same thing that freedom schools were fighting against. How can we put people in a position where it's not so much about the information that we pushing down into their heads, but the information that we able to extract from them, from asking critical questions, from putting people in a position to do critical thinking, to come up with critical questions. Organizing is simply the act of putting critical people in touch with critical places and critical work that need to be functioning together. When you think about the legacy of freedom schools, you think about C.T. Vivian and John Lewis died last year, with their whole lives been dedicated to work that they've been in since the late 50s, early 60s. The impact of that work, once it starts to live in you, the way that they said, well, why is Fannie Lou Hamer, this uneducated woman from Mississippi, speaking in front of the National Democratic Convention, the Democratic National Convention? And Bob Moses says, no one carries the story of Mississippi in their bones in the way that a Fannie Lou Hamer does. And so what we are looking at now, from what Freedom Schools and what Freedom Summer left us, is this whole transition to stay in real intent that everybody has a place in this. Everybody can be included in movement work. Black Lives Matter right now is the mantra. In the 60s, it was the same thing. It was a push to say that Black Lives Matter, Black freedoms matter, that we shouldn't be killed at the hands of the police. We shouldn't be killed at the hands of neighbors who don't like our presence, that we shouldn't have to live in a state like Mississippi under the banner that was the state flag that reminds you every day that this is a place that tried to oppress you, control you. They tried to make sure that you wouldn't be able to unleash your talents and your gifts and your freedoms to the world. And Freedom Summer, and particularly Freedom School, were places that went against that narrative. They said you do deserve to be able to live fully as who you are. You do deserve to be proud of the body that you were born in. You do deserve to do the work that brings freedom and liberation and respect to the communities that you come from. And so that's why you see people like Macy Brown, a young college student in Jackson, Mississippi, who led the largest march. It was a Black Lives Matter march this past July. The largest post-civil rights march in the state of Mississippi. And it was hugely interracial, but it was all centered around this idea that our freedom belongs to us and that our freedom is intertwined with the people who also try to deny us our freedoms. And so those are the things and the critical lessons that we get from things like Freedom Schools and Freedom Summer. And then self-expression. I know that when I was 12 and 13, Charlie Cobb would walk into a school with 2 arms full of blank notebooks, and you knew that you were about to write until you got to the last pages of those notebooks. And we thought it was just writing, and we thought it was aggravating. But what we started to learn how to do was express ourselves and freely express ourselves and go back and read our words and document our life, document our history, document our thoughts, document the conditions of our community. And so now you see so many kids who came through the Algebra Project when they got relationship problems, work problems, social problems. Everybody still knows how to journal. We go and we write these things down and we preserve our thoughts, we preserve where we were in our thinking in different places in history. And there's so many lessons that come from what was laid on the ground before us in the 50s and 60s, in times way before that. And the other thing that I think is happening, that's just as enormous as anything, is that the Ella Bakers of today don't have to be the king whisperers. So they don't have to sit to the side and say, Dr. King, this is what you should say, right? that the Fannie Lou Hamers of today don't have to be invited to be on the stage, where we see that all the folks that I talked about with Black women, Tamika, Alicia, Oprah, the folks with Black Lives Matter, like what it is now is we have a different space where the people who've proven to us all along that they know how to take us where we need to go are actually being able to be in the front and lead us at a lot faster pace with a lot more strategy, and that we have the resources and the tools that we need when we looking at what Black women have done for this country historically, but also the ways that they've stepped up in these contemporary times to really, really make sure that Black voices are elevated, heard, and lifted up. And so it's so much of an honor to think about Flonzie Brown, to think about Frankie Adams Johnson, to think about Unita Blackwell, and all of the folks in Mississippi who had June Johnson, all these people who had done so much work that now, like, the things that they had to do in the background are the things that we have to put to the forefront and follow now, because it's taking those places, it's moving things, it's moving the needle, and it'll move this country. And all those things can be attached to Freedom Summer, Freedom Schools, the Civil Rights Movement, and the overall struggle for Black liberation in this country ever since the first Black enslaved feet was set on the soil.
Wow. You see the hands, don't you, Albert? So what you have just heard is the voice of Albert Sykes. You saw him, and of course he is a product of those you've heard before and all of those he mentioned. And there are so many young people who have their boots to the ground doing the work that that is an extension of the civil rights movement. So thanks, Albert, for that. And of course, one of the things that Albert talked about was freedom. And what we have to understand, even in this conversation, and when we leave this particular space, is that each of us has a stake in freedom. So Albert, thank you for that.
Yeah,
so,
Dad, can I say one last thing?
Sure thing.
And it just like, and also like not forgetting what's happening when we talking about people crossing borders or building bridges. We also got to think about what this country is doing to our immigrant population. The largest anti-immigrant raid in the history of the United States happened in Mississippi 2 years ago. Then you look at the chicken plants that's just announced that they're about to start closing in Mississippi because they don't have free and cheap labor. When you go look at what's happening at the borders with forced hysterectomies, when you're looking at young people being wrapped up in blankets and being left to sleep in the car, like we gotta really, really think about this as an intertwined thing where it's not just what's happening to Black people, but it's what's happening to so many people at the hands of the American government, even poor white people who've been convinced over time and still are convinced today that as long as you're doing better than the worst Black person, you're okay. As long as you're doing better than the people who've been relegated to the bottom of the social totem pole, then you're doing all right. And we're allowing our people to suffer. So when you think about folks that descended on Mississippi for Freedom Summer, you think about folks that descended on the South during the whole civil rights movement, dissension is different now. We have to descend on our kitchen tables. We have to descend on our Bible study meetings. We have to descend on our neighborhood association meetings. Like now is more personal about who we hold accountable, who and what we stand for, alongside the ways that we're gonna push this country. And then that's it. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Well, look, you said a lot, and that's a lot for all of us to carry forward. And hopefully we can all carry this into the breakout rooms. So at this particular moment in time, we will go into our breakout rooms and be there for 15 minutes. And this will give you an opportunity to ask questions, also have reflections on this evening's conversation about Freedom Summer. And one of the aims of the Mississippi-Massachusetts series is to explore how people cross borders and build bridges. And we're asking that when you go into these breakout rooms, think about what stood out to you about the experiences of our speakers. What kinds of borders did they cross when working together? What made crossing borders possible? Also think about what lessons you will take away from this evening's conversation about interracial work and the work that brings people together, insiders and outsiders today. And also think, last but not least, about the overall legacy of the Mississippi Summer Project, which is famously known as Freedom Summer. But now I'll turn it over to Catherine Stevens to explain how to get into the breakout rooms.
Thanks, Daphne, and thank you to all of our speakers. I think everyone's looking forward to talking about what they've heard. So for breakout rooms, it's very simple. You will see a message come up on your screen that says, join this breakout room. If you just click that button, you will be whisked away to a room with 5 or 6 other participants in this meeting, some from Massachusetts, some from Mississippi, some from elsewhere. And I'm going to post the questions Daphne just read in the chat right now. And so when you go to the breakout room, if you reopen the chat, you'll have the questions right there as prompts for your discussion. All right, so in a few moments, our handy Miss Mass staff will send us into breakout rooms.
Mm-hmm. So, Catherine, I mean, should we wrap it up?
Yeah, we are all back from breakout rooms and already wanting to continue the conversation. So what I'll suggest is for everyone to place in the chat maybe a key thought or idea that came up in your breakout room, and we can see those in the chat, and I believe Dr. Chamberlain will sort of read some of those out as we're getting ready to conclude the program. So if you're able to open up the chat, you can type in some final thoughts you have based on your conversation.
Just some thoughts from or reflections coming out of some of the breakout rooms. We have Jennifer Hallwood, who says the power of integrated neighborhoods. Emily Ratliff says she sees so many friends on this call from Mississippi and Massachusetts, and she says thank you for organizing this conversation, and glad to hear from Albert. Kate Clifford Larson says that this was moving and enlightening and exciting. Jennifer Mazenko from Mississippi, creating opportunities in Mississippi to bring youth brain drain return. Timothy Benoit of Massachusetts, it's beautiful to see the work that continues to be done in the South and how important it is to the rest of the country. Wonderful to hear everyone's stories. I learned so much. Massachusetts, Ellen. It is important for Massachusetts and Mississippi residents to visit and learn about each other. Peggy Kemp, very rich experience. Far too short, all speakers give me much to think about, and the breakout room left me with many more questions. Thank you. Susan Eisenberg, in this country, difficult moment in this country, we're clearly beneficiaries of this earlier work. I agree. Okay, Ashley Easterling, I appreciated hearing about the experiences of the people who came to Mississippi for 1964. It's amazing the way the work succeeded. A diverse group of young versus old, educated and urban versus uneducated and rural, gives me hope we can work together again. Any other thoughts?
I think that last thought about old and young, urban and rural, Massachusetts and Mississippi, learning how to work together is probably the thought to end on. So I want to thank everyone so much for coming, and I'm gonna let Stuart Rockoff give our final thanks, and then I'm going to update everyone on our next Miss Mass program.
Well, I just want to thank everybody for kind of sticking with us and being part of this conversation. It was wonderful to see so many new and old faces. I want to thank the panelists for sharing their experiences with us. I want to thank the staffs of both humanities councils, and I want to give particular thanks to my friend Catherine Stevens, who really took the lead and organized a lot of this, and it was just a pleasure to work with her. So Catherine, please close us out.
Thank you.
All right. It was a great pleasure to work with everyone in Mississippi as well. So first of all, we always welcome feedback on events. And so you'll see in the chat, there is a link to a short survey. So if you click on that link right now and open it in a browser, it'll just be there for you to fill out after this event closes. We'll also follow up with an email with that link so you can fill out the survey at your leisure. If you're interested in learning more about Freedom Summer, though I know there are many folks on this call who are very informed about it, we will follow up as well with a curated list of some additional readings and resources. Finally, our next Miss Mass event is going to be Thursday, February 11th. So I know many of you were just getting started in your conversations. If you come to that event, you'll be able to have more conversations and we will be letting you know about that event. It will be about the environment and environmental humanities in both of our states. So thank you again, and thank you, Daphne, for being such a fantastic moderator and bringing us all together in this program. So have a good evening, everyone. Be well, and hopefully we will see you again and stay in touch.
Thank you very much.
Bye.